It's Thursday, May 21st. This is the second to last video that you will have that includes teaching. The final week will be devoted to doing your final and the final quiz. So let me review those very quickly. Quiz 24 is due on Friday, May 29th. The question is, how has the war on terror changed the world? So you can see how that is expected to be done. You've done a number of these by now, so it should be relatively familiar. And then test number 8 is due Friday, May 29th. Minimum 75 words per question. Email it, submit it in the packet. Remember that in the final week, there is no Wednesday packet. There is only a Friday packet for the high school. So all the open notes, open video, no plagiarism, no working together. So you have a choice concerning the homework. If you do the homework for chapters 22, 23, and 24, you must do 5 of the questions. If you don't do the homework, you need to do 10 of the questions. Now, the homework, I think, is a little more work, but it's an easier way to get a perfect grade. So just giving you a heads up on that. So if you do the homework, which I believe is a little bit harder to do, but it guarantees a better grade, then you only have to do 5 of the test questions. If you don't do the homework, do all 10 of the 10 questions. So the test questions, there are 10 of them total. Here they are. What were some of the causes of World War II? Why was Winston Churchill so important? What was Blitzkrieg? What happened at the Battle of Midway? What was Operation Overlord? How did World War II end? What was the Cold War? What was the Marshall Plan? How did the Cold War end? And then what was Operation Desert Storm? So those 10 questions, they are due Friday, May 29th, and essentially that's the final assignment of the year. So if you have any questions, please feel free to email me. I'll do my best to respond. You can get started right away. As soon as you submit it, basically you're done with history for the year. So congratulations. Okay, let's get to our new material. Talking about the post-Cold War, we're looking at various nations and how they have developed since the 1990s. We turn our attention to Russia. Vladimir Putin spent his early career as a low-level intelligence officer for the KGB. With a lot of the information concerning Putin, it's difficult to ascertain what is true and what is false because he has sort of created a myth about him. His career has been largely shaped by fortunate friendships. He has befriended and been befriended by powerful people, by bold moves. He took initiative when many people did not see the opportunity, and a little bit of luck. Under Yeltsin, he became the director of what was called the FSB, which is the new version of the KGB. This is Vladimir Putin when he was a younger man, when he was still rising to the top of Russia. In 1909, he was chosen by Boris Yeltsin to be the new prime minister of Russia, the 5th prime minister in the last year and a half. At the time, the Russian government was dividing power between the president, Yeltsin, and then the prime minister. And Yeltsin had gone through a number of prime ministers. Putin was chosen primarily because he was nothing. He was nobody. And so he didn't create any fear, any concern. He had very little record. It was a surprise choice. He was a complete unknown. However, this was the rise of the Chechen issue. There was a region within Russia called Chechnya, inhabited primarily by Muslims, Chechens. They were pushing for independence. There was a series of terrorist attacks, and Russia, under Putin, responded with furious, overwhelming force, even though they did suffer quite a bit of casualties. So he became kind of the candidate of law and order, which was very ironic because law and order is really not what he's about. Putin quickly made deals as he rose to power with the oligarchs. Yeltsin was now out of the picture. Putin had filled the gap. The oligarchs were a small group of very rich, very corrupt men who controlled almost all of Russia economically. They were the ones who had, through underhanded means, gained control of most of the state industries and made them personal property. By making this team with the oligarchs, Putin was able to create and consolidate a power base. Over time, most of his opposition have discovered that, or have died through mysterious means, specifically poisoning, not even always in Russia, sometimes in other places. Much of Russia is corrupt, and much of it is decaying even today because of the kleptocracy of Putin. Putin has turned Russia into his own bank account, his own plaything. I'm sure maybe he might say he's doing it for the good of Russia, for the good of the nation, but really he operates for the good of Vladimir Putin. Putin's main international goal is furthering his own position, which often means disorder and chaos for other nations. So the stories of Russian interference in the United States election, those things, those work within his own goals. He's working toward his ends, which are his own profit. He has been helped because his counterpart in the United States, he's had 3 consecutive inept presidents. Neither George W. Bush nor President Barack Obama nor President Donald Trump have shown any real skill in being able to outmaneuver President Putin. In fact, all of them, to various degrees, have been regularly humiliated by him. Probably this has become so common, it's almost so in short, what's happened is he's gained a reputation that he probably doesn't deserve. Against these inferior opponents, he's succeeded, but capable presidents who used to have a coherent foreign policy that included a robust outlook for the United States would have easily outmaneuvered Putin and put him in some very difficult positions. It's just we haven't had that in quite some time. In 1998, the world turned its attention to the war in the Balkans, the Balkan Peninsula in Eastern Europe. Serbian President Slobodan Milosevic led his people to commit genocide against the Kosovo Albanians and others. Eventually, the United States and the United Nations intervened. That was in the mid to late 1990s. In Asia, India finally gained independence all the way back in 1947, largely as a result, by the way, of their work in World War II. During World War II, they had fought bravely and nobly and notably, and they were granted independence. Mahatma Gandhi used passive resistance to lead Great Britain to finally do the right thing in 47. This was really the last episode of peace. Since then, Hindu India and Muslim Pakistan have been in near constant conflict that actually deserves its own entire day, which we just cannot afford. Most African nations were colonies in the 19th century, and they became independent nations in the 20th. They did not have centuries of cultural heritage to fall back upon to guide them in the establishment of nationhood. And so that created some significant problems. Africa was, and in some ways continues to be, primarily tribal. And by tribal, I don't mean primitive. What I mean is that they organize themselves along tribes versus kingdoms versus nations versus clans. There's variations in all of them. They're primarily a tribal outlook. And not all of Africa. Africa is enormous. Geographically, I believe it's larger than the United States. It's not, I believe. It is larger than the United States. Ethnically, very diverse, a massive population. So it's hard to speak of Africa. But there are some notable distinctions of the area. Most African nations have experienced a series of dictators, coups, and other failed governments. There are a few nations who have risen above and have sort of set an example, but there has been a lot of failure in Africa over the last 70 years. Several nations have begun to see increased stability, which has also brought increased prosperity. However, in the midst of this, wars over religions and tribes continue. Africa, like Europe and Asia, has seen its share of genocide as well. The best known story is that of South Africa. South Africa was an English colony for quite some time. For years, South Africa practiced what was called apartheid, which was a division between the black folk and the white folk. Eventually, international pressure began to form for this great injustice. This is a sign from South Africa during the period in which it was divided between what white people could use and what black people could use. In 1990, Frederick de Klerk, he was the president of South Africa, his government finally released Nelson Mandela from prison. Nelson Mandela had spent most of his life working for equality for black Africans, and that meant freedom, just basic freedoms. He spent, I believe it was 18 years in a Praetorian jail. South Africa eventually wrote a new constitution. In 1994, South Africa took the major step of electing Nelson Mandela as president, so became president of the nation that had imprisoned him for so long. It represented a major step forward. Since then, progress has come in fits and other limitations. We've seen advancements, we've seen detractments, 2 steps forward, 1 step back. And so there's still a lot of question as what will Africa be in the future. The increased access to medicine and better nutrition has led to a population explosion in Africa. Mortality used to be much higher, and now what we're seeing is people are living longer. However, that has been offset by the incredibly destructive plague of AIDS that has spread through Africa. Now, America's work concerning HIV and AIDS has played an important role in the development of Africa. It's one of the undersung stories of this century. President George W. Bush took the lead in providing anti-AIDS drugs to Africa from the United States, and he has saved literally millions of lives. He does not get the credit he deserves, but there are few presidents who can actually say they have saved more lives than President George W. Bush. For good or for ill in his presidency, what he did in Africa was truly a work of humanitarian noteworthiness. Africa's rich natural resources are providing new opportunities. Unfortunately, corruption and terrorism have made things difficult, and there's really not an end in sight for some of those challenges. In Latin America, governmental instability has been the norm. Most dictatorships have faded, and some degree of democracy has risen in their place, but that's not universal. And even the democracies that exist in Latin America and South America, some of them are very questionable. Cuba and Venezuela remain unfortunate exceptions. They continue to be dictatorships. Venezuela has gone from being the richest per capita nation of Latin America to the poorest due to communist dictatorships. Started with Hugo Chavez. This continues with this man, Nicolas Maduro, an old-fashioned communist thug who has destroyed his nation and continues to make him and his friends wealthy at the expense of his own people. All right, we will continue tomorrow.